Good morning, my lovely year 10s. Our last unit of work. And the great thing is, by the end of it, we'll be back together and talk to each other face to face. Wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, I'll best go on with it because I'll run out of time. So, this is evolution by natural selection. So, we've done a nice little, hopefully, it's a nice narrative from the cell through systems into how organisms interact and then how they came to be. So, the final. So, evolution, selection, look at some ways that we can lead to new species. So these three significant characters get their little space in that moment in time. However, of course, there are many others who are working in the field as well. Difficult field to work in at the time these guys are working in it because the church still had a fair bit of sway with how things worked in our society. Not that they don't necessarily now, but certainly a lot more in those days. And so Charles Darwin, who came from a very long line of priests and bishops, and was studying for the priesthood himself when he first started at university, sat on his book for a long time because he knew how controversial it was going to be and what sort of controversy he would create and how much anger would be sent towards you. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was the first to sort of put a theory forward, and he suggested that we changed because we had to. So he looked at giraffes, for instance, and felt that they had grown their longer necks because they were straining to reach the higher leaves and not compete with lower browsing animals. And it sounds, quite reasonable until you realise that, of course, you can't then pass that stretch on to your next generation. In Lamarck's time, to his defence, we had no idea about how you passed on information. Charles Darwin, on the other hand, through his travels, realised that the diversity of species was such that there had to be a better explanation, had to be a better form. Now, he still didn't have an understanding of how that happened. And there's a story that in his library, the journal in which the monk Gregor Mendel published his work on genetics was never read. It was on his shelf but never read. So he had a mechanism he could have used to explain what was going on. But he recognised natural selection as a process and put that forward. Nowhere in his book did he actually say that humans are evolved from monkeys, but the implication was pretty obvious and people really didn't like it. He was forced to publish in the end because of Alfred Wallace. He'd been sitting on his book for about 20 odd years, and Wallace was working in Indonesia and Northern Australia, that sort of part of the world, and was seeing the same things that Darwin was seeing and came up with the same outcome. And he wrote his work up and sent it to Charles Darwin's great friend Robert Hooke and said, can I publish this through the Royal Society? And Hooke said to Darwin, you better publish. You've got to publish that book of yours because Wallace is about to beat you to it. And so that forced Darwin's hand. But it could have easily been Wallace's theory because it was the same theory. And what is that theory? Well, essentially, we're talking about change over time. So it needs massive time for this to occur. We're talking about a 4.6 billion year old planet now, which they didn't have in those days. They didn't think the planet was that old. It's about the change of frequency of alleles, and alleles are a form of a gene. So you are all mixtures of alleles. You get an allele from each parent, and for most of our characteristics, there are multiple alleles present. So you can only have two of them yourself, but there are many available. And so those frequencies of those alleles will change due to circumstances in the environment, and therefore we see the arising of new species quite often. Well, that's what the theory states. So our modern theory basically says that a population must reproduce to replace itself. There are an excess of potential offspring, so there are always more than you need. There is variation amongst those offspring, that's allelic variation, so variation in their genes. Certain individuals will be selected for by the environment, so they'll be more fit for their environment. They'll get to survive and pass on their genes. Over time, that adaptation changes, so this animal, let's say, starts to change to fit its environment more. And as chance effects determine these allele frequencies, divergence and speciation will finally occur. So we have a lizard which once was able to breed with other local lizards, all of a sudden has changed so much that it can no longer breed back to that group. So we now see it as a separate species. That's a classic species test. Although our species test now tends to be genetically based rather than breeding based. And the great story which got Darwin going was these Galapagos finches. They're all related to one ancestral species that somehow or other blew in from mainland South America. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands. They are disappearing as faster they're appearing as they move closer towards the South American coast. We'll talk a bit more about that sort of evidence later. But because they're volcanic islands, they're bare. So there's niches for animals to take over. The plants had already moved in and the animals come later, and they were arriving and discovering spaces to grow into. So we had this what's called adaptive radiation, which we now understand is controlled by master genes, which allows for much faster evolution than you normally expect. And all of these species are variations on the original, but they're all using different parts of the environment to avoid competition. And so we had this massive speciation event. And we see that in cichlid fish in lakes in Africa as well. So the theory of natural selection says there is variation with respect to various traits. Some traits are better suited to survival than others. Not all individuals will survive and reproduce, so those who are better suited will, and they'll cause a change. Those individuals that do survive and reproduce will have suitable traits in a new environment, and these traits will slowly increase over time. And that's when you get speciation over time. So we'll explain that more later. And then there are some events that occur. So these things like gene flow. So when animals of a population, from one population, join a new population, they often bring new genetic variations with the new alleles with them. And that creates greater diversity in your population here. So we like immigration. Immigration's good, genetically speaking. Now, we always have these fights about whether immigration to Australia of humans is good, but they bring not just new genes, but new cultural expression. We get diversity, and diversity, as hopefully you're getting the hang of by now, is a really important consideration for the longevity of a species. Diversity is good. Genetic drift is another sort of chance event where alleles slowly disappear over time. And if we were in class, we'd have a little bit of fun with a little coin flipping project, and you end up with an allele disappearing. So we've got here some homozygous dominant individuals, some homozygous recessive individuals, and some heterozygous individuals. Hopefully you remember some genetics from year 9. And as plants evolve and, well, as they breed and move forward in time, this generation starts to change. And over a few generations, in this case over 2 generations, we've still got 10 plants, but now they are only homozygous dominant. There are no longer any of the recessive allele present. Things have changed enormously. And one of those we saw in our own Australian situation. When Europeans first arrived in Australia, they found that the Aboriginal population at the time had no B allele. They only had an A allele for their blood. So you could be A or O, but you couldn't be B and you couldn't be AB. So there was an allele missing from the blood of that group. So that was there was a founder effect with the original Indigenous people who arrived in Australia. Those original Australians did not bring the B allele with them. So we call this the founder effect. So a small population of a new group arrive in a space that hasn't had them before, but often they'll bring a narrow group of alleles. So in the case of Australian Aborigines, that allele that's missing in the blood group is the group B. In the case on here, there's this famous one that was studied on Martha's Vineyard, an island in North America, up the New England coast. There's a population of people from England arrived here in the 1600s. They were closely related. They were a religious group who were persecuted in Europe, and they arrived here and brought with them certain genetic conditions, including a form of deafness, that persisted for a long time until immigration into the Martha's Vineyard, and still occurs there. So all these things affect how a population might change and which direction it might change in. And then, of course, the last of these is what's considered a bottleneck. So the cheetah is a great example of the bottleneck. About 10,000 years ago, there was one female left. We don't know how many males, because we can't test for that. We can only follow mitochondrial DNA for this purpose. But we know there's only one female. And she obviously had a litter. And so our extant population of cheetahs is related to her. But that means genetically they don't have diversity. Humans went through a very similar situation way back as well, a couple of years ago. And we are very closely related. There's not a great deal of variation in human populations because of the bottleneck that occurred in us. Probably more than cheetahs because there's more of us and we've spread out more and we've had longer to become more diverse, but still we are really closely related. Way back to Eve, so they call her mitochondrial Eve, the original female. Again, we know there's one female as our progenitor. We don't have any males that stood around at the time. So there's a lot of other genetics from the males that we don't know about. But bottlenecks cause another way of either extinction or a new speciation. And that's sort of a natural selection in a nutshell. We get a chance to talk about it in class as well. Soon, we're going to be back together and we can actually talk to each other. That'd be nice. But for now, I have to leave you on style.